This is one of the most famous arguments for believing in God. Note, that's belief. This is not an argument for the existence of God. Pascal thought you could never know whether God existed or not, but you could work out that belief was literally a better bet than not believing. It's prudent to believe. What do we mean when we say that belief is rational because it is prudent? It means that we're looking at the benefits that come with that belief. It's practical or pragmatic to believe. I'm just throwing pragmatic in there because it's the technical term for what Pascal was proposing. We're not going to worry about it. Mostly what we do with reason, or what we're meant to do with it, is seek truth. Knowledge. That's all epistemic means here. But when you can't reach the truth because you can't ever get the evidence you need, you can bring in prudential considerations, like the belief that a healthy diet and moderate exercise will bring about better health is a prudential belief, because putting it into action secures those goods, physical fitness and so on. It happens to be an evidentially supported one too, but it's mainly benefits directed, and possibly over-believing is useful. What worried Pascal about belief in God was the chasm between puny little us with very basic intellectual equipment and an essentially unknowable God. We can't know whether he exists or what he's like, if he does exist. And it is he, I'm afraid. It was a long time ago. But Pascal still thought it was a good idea to believe in God anyway in case he did exist. But how to persuade people of that? How about encouraging them to gamble? Here's the predicament. Most of the time, when we can't know something, the right thing to do is to suspend judgment. But if you do that with the existence of God, you effectively decide he doesn't exist. Either he does or he doesn't. A don't know and do nothing plan puts you in with all the non-believers. That's why agnostics and atheists always get lumped together. The can't know brigade tend not to practice a religion. And non-believers miss out on all the benefits that come with belief. His bridge over that chasm between us and God was to recommend that people bet that God does exist and act accordingly. The obvious benefit, if God exists and you believe, is that you go to heaven. If he exists and you don't believe, you go to hell. So there's an infinite gain or an infinite loss to be had if God exists. But Pascal thought there would be this worldly benefits to belief, like being on the path to virtue and moral goodness, instead of spending your life on corrupt pleasures. Wood makes quite a thing of this, but you might object that non-believers can also be virtuous and have meaningful activities that give life value and are not necessarily corrupt. The idea of virtue being exclusively for believers and non-believers' pleasures always being corrupt is a pair of false alternatives we can safely quibble over. But what if God doesn't exist? If God doesn't exist, there are no infinite gains or losses. And this worldly costs also disappear. Traditionally, the worldly gains for belief don't register, but these benefits occur whether God exists or not. So there should be this worldly gains for believers even if God doesn't exist. Maybe those non-believers whose pleasures are corrupt lose in this life, but there's no reason to think non-believers on the whole are being led from the path of virtue. It looks like a small win for believers and no loss for non-believers if God doesn't exist. And we should say here there's zero gain for believers after death. Some philosophers reject the whole pragmatist project and say you are never justified in believing beyond the evidence. It's a big ask for people to forego the possibility of eternal life in order to be intellectually virtuous, so maybe the question is, when is it acceptable? And when is it unacceptable? It is never acceptable to believe against the evidence. So if there's a lot more evidence against the existence of God than for it, belief in God would be an illegitimate use of prudential reason. Where something is unknowable, or in technical terms, evidentially undecidable, then the use of prudential reason is sometimes acceptable. There are prudential costs to belief in God. Now, I don't think Wood needs to mention martyrdom. There are some costs all believers face. There's money donated to religious organisations that could have been spent on other things. There's the time that goes into it. And there are the restrictions on what you can do for fun. If God doesn't exist, you only get this worldly benefits, so the costs might outweigh the benefits. But you'll still make the bet, because costs are factored into the calculation of expected value. And losing bets is all part of gambling. That's what makes it a gamble. You should still make the bet. And look what happens when you plug in infinity in the form of infinite gains or losses. No costs could be higher than the potential gain. So why don't people just head for the nearest church? The first problem is that belief isn't voluntary. You can't just switch it on. But belief is what you have to qualify for the benefits. Pascal recommends that people just go to Mass, remember he was Catholic, pray, and do all the things that believers do, and genuine belief will come. We have indirect influence over our beliefs by choosing what we do. The many gods objection is harder to overcome. Which god are you meant to bet on? If it's to be the god of monotheism, and even more specifically the Christian God, what reason do you have that makes it the only choice? For Pascal, it was obvious that Christian God was the only God in play. All other religions were wrong, hence missionaries. But if you say God is unknowable, as Pascal does, you are just asking for a skeptical response when you recommend this God and that practice. It can really only appeal to someone who shares the assumptions. One being that God is omnipotent, so logically there can only be one, and it happens to be the one who revealed himself. Pascal believed on the basis of religious experience. Fine for a 17th century French non-believer, less plausible for people now. Then there's the worry that prudential belief isn't going to cut it. Prudential beliefs tend to be a bit weak and indecisive because they aren't based on a lot of evidence. So beliefs about diet might be interim because new diets might come along that are better. Belief in God is meant to be wholehearted, decisive commitment. But some prudential beliefs can require and get decisive assent. I've taken an example from William James and brought it up to date. A climber is stuck on a mountain. She can't go back, only forward. That means jumping a gap, and if she doesn't make it, she'll fall to her death. The gap is wider than she'd like. If she jumps tentatively or nervously, wondering if she'll fall, she's more likely to fall. But if she wholeheartedly believes she'll make it, she's more likely to make it. She'll jump with confidence and strength. The belief is required to bring about the benefits. Doubt is death. How is this like Pascal's wager? One thing is that she doesn't know what the truth of the matter is. She doesn't know whether she can jump safely or not. The potential believer doesn't know whether God exists or not. But here's the difference. If the climber believes she can do it, she influences the truth of the belief. Her belief helps make it true. But for the potential believer, her belief makes no difference to whether God exists or not. The best Pascal can offer here is that the believer opens up to the possibility of having a religious experience that authenticates her belief. However, we've seen in the previous playlist that might not work as well as Pascal thought. It's worth pointing out that the prospect of infinite loss for non-believers is hotly contested. Pascal assumes that non-believers go to hell, but there is a problem with hell. Basically, it's this: an all-loving, infinitely merciful God would not condemn anyone to an eternity of suffering. Same if God is infinitely just. Punishing finite wrongdoing with an infinite punishment is unjust. Watered-down versions of hell as eternal separation from God, chosen by the person, not God, don't escape the problem. The decisions of an imperfect human in a short lifetime can't merit eternal separation, and God could override them because he's omnipotent. If we take infinite loss out of the calculation, what happens to non-believers if God exists? According to some analyses of God's love and mercy, they would end up in heaven, because either hell is empty or it doesn't exist. And what does that do to the wager argument?